This episode of Earl Grey is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet, and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the nonprofit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org.
Hi, this is Robert O'Reilly. My name is Gowron. Honor to you and your house. You're listening to Trek FM.
T. Earl Grey hot.
Hello and welcome to another exciting episode of Earl Grey. I'm your judge, jury, and of course, the executioner, Richard Marquez. And joined with me today on the plaintiff side is Justin Ozer. How you doing, Justin?
I'm doing good, but it sounds like I should be afraid. You have the power to execute people?
Well, let's hope not, right?
All right, cute.
And then on the defendant side, we have the lovely Amy Nelson. How you doing, Amy?
I'm doing good. I will defend valiantly as best I can.
Well, before we go into what we're going to be talking about for the show, we're going to go over some of the Babel Conference feedback that we've recently received for the...
it was episode 206, which was Actors Who Got Their Starts on TNG Part 2.
There we go. So, Justin, why don't you start us off with the first comment?
All right, so Greg Malumbi said, Richard, the Will Ferrell movie you were thinking about was old school, one of the most quotable movies ever, probably.
I agree. It probably is the most quotable. I mean, I know you've never seen it, but yeah.
Of course I have. I mean, listeners should know. I haven't seen it.
Have you seen that, Amy? Have you seen that movie, Amy?
No, I have not. Not a big Will Ferrell fan.
Oh, this is a great movie. I mean, my favorite quote is, "We're going streaking!" Woo! Okay, anyway. Amy, you want to do the second one?
Yeah, so Tim Hans says, listening to Bryan Singer's directing filmography and other projects on your rundown of actors, though as you say, Singer really was not an actor, I'm amazed you failed to mention the pitch he once made for a new Star Trek television series following the cancellation of Enterprise and before the first Kelvin Timeline movie was greenlit, which was to be titled Star Trek Federation, which was to be set during year 3000, a few hundred years after the United Federation planet had collapsed, which chronicled the ancestors of one James T. Kirk putting together a new USS Enterprise and a new era of exploration. If you've never come across this story and series, I did, which Singer pitched, but sadly failed to reach the planning stage when it was worth Googling and looking it up. So, Tim, thank you for including that. I did not see that, and I did not know about it.
And thank you, Tim, for helpfully sending us through Messenger a link about the pitch. I had heard about it a little bit, but it would have been interesting where that would have gone to go so far into the future. Who knows? But yeah, I think there were some other pitches around like that. Like there's one for an animated series called Final Frontier, which would have taken place in the 26th century. But I think all those things got swept aside when the Kelvin Timeline movies came. But very interesting. I didn't know he was involved in that.
I briefly heard about that. I didn't know who was the one who pitched it and everything. But yeah, definitely. I actually heard about Federation, and I'm glad he said something. So thank you, Tim, very much for that information.
So listeners, this is the last time we have to remind you about the iTunes contest, which goes through December 31st, where if you put a star rating and written review in iTunes and you're in the US, you'll have the opportunity to win the wonderful prize, The Art of Juan Ortiz for The Next Generation. 178 amazing prints for each episode of The Next Generation. So hopefully you'll head on over to iTunes if you're in the US and give us a star rating and written review for a chance to win that book.
All right. Now on to the episode. Before this gracious court now appear these prisoners to answer the multiple and gracious savagery of Earl Grey. How plead you, hosts?
I
Not
plead
guilty.
Oh, no, that's wrong.
No.
Guards,
No.
shoot.
Oh, Amy's gone. Oh no. I'll do it. I plead guilty provisionally.
Well, from the sounds of it, I hope you guys are thinking that we're going to be talking about courtroom dramas, which is exactly what we're going to be talking about. So today we'll be starting a 2-part series talking about courtroom dramas in The Next Generation. First, so that we don't get involved in a courtroom drama of our own, we'd like to thank Standard Orbit as inspiration for this episode as they looked at TOS courtroom dramas in Standard Orbit 193. We'd also like to thank listener Rebecca Skipper for suggesting that we do something similar here on Earl Grey for the TNG courtroom dramas. Thank you, Rebecca, for definitely doing that. And Ken, don't sue us. Go Army.
Now we're for sure going to get sued.
Yeah, he's not going to like that.
Okay, the day that we're recording this is actually today's the Army-Navy game, and actually it starts in about 15 minutes. So, yeah, we're gonna knock this one out.
Yeah, I've been seeing your posts going back and forth, or you're like, boo, Navy, go Army. I'm like, oh, goodness. It's been fun.
Yes, it has. So, in this episode, we're going to be discussing Encounter at Farpoint, Justice, The Measure of a Man, A Matter of Perspective, Sins of the Father, and then that's it. I see final thoughts there.
Well, that's the ones we're discussing today. We'll have more next time.
Right, we'll have more next time. But let's start with Encounter at Farpoint. So obviously we've seen this episode before. It's so many times before. It's the beginning of TNG, and of course it starts out. In my eyes, it's like a court martial, but without the 3 other judges. So, what did you guys think of this whole setting of basically trial by fire and all that?
Well, I think it's something that's really interesting with TNG starting right off in the first episode with this really unusual trial, a trial for, I guess, basically the crimes of humanity presided over by an omnipotent being who's judge, jury, executioner. And if you think about like the ones in the original series, for the most part, it was, standard trials or hearings, but they were starting out with something I think really unusual. And I think I made some notes on some of the other ones. There's some kind of unusual trials and hearings that you have in the Next Generation. It's not just the run of the mill, like someone committed an offense on the ship and you have to decide whether they're guilty or innocent. This is something very unusual, I think, the kind of trial that you have here. I mean, what do you think, Amy?
I agree. I found it very interesting because they are bringing a certain person, Picard and his crew or whatever, for the crimes of humanity. And they mentioned like, well, you can't do that. And so it must have been before that people were being, punished for crimes against humanity, against, what their forefathers did or their ancestors did. So I found that very interesting that, in our quote unquote future that, I might be held accountable for something that, 5 great grandparents did, in the past. And so they finally made this law where you can't do that. And, Q is like, no, we can still do it. I thought, oh, okay.
Yeah, and he cites some legal precedent, doesn't he? Like,
Right.
By this precedent of 20 whatever, I can do that. And I'm also omnipotent. So he's basically saying, I'm omnipotent, so just like shut up and go through the proceeding. It's like, whoa. I mean, and also, I think it tells you a lot about Q that this is his first appearance, and the first thing he wants to do is to judge a species that he comes across. It tells you a lot about his character, that's kind of the first thing that he would do, that he wouldn't do something like, oh, hey, I see you're exploring. Let's talk that over and see what. No, he's going to do something very, very confrontational and very consequential.
Another thing I found interesting was, they talk about, well, you're guilty until proven innocent. And of course, bringing the innocent to trial would be unfair. And I thought that's an interesting twist on what our court system is right now, and it's like, well, of course we wouldn't bring the innocent to trial. And so in a sense, it almost has a logic to it.
And there's some interesting other places in the Next Generation where you see that. Actually, one we'll talk about a little later, a matter of perspective. This alien species talks about our standard is guilty until proven innocent. And I think in the Cardassian justice system it's in Deep Space Nine, but I mean, basically it's the same thing, guilty until proven innocent. So it's interesting that they're kind of flipping that on its head, where we would think that's very much something that's unfair. But there are other species or other beings that are like, of course this is fair. Why would you bring the innocent to trial? We know who's guilty. And it's just such a different perspective than we would see. I mean, although in our own history on Earth, there have been, different regimes and cultures that have basically done the same kind of thing, that you're considered, guilty until proven innocent. And maybe there isn't even a possibility to be proven innocent. You're already found guilty. So yeah, it's really interesting to look at that and to look at Q's standard. At the same time, he, in the end, after he does this judgment, he is very forgiving of them. Much more.
Well,
yeah.
At first.
No, I mean, because in the way that he starts out is he said, you're on trial for the crimes of humanity. You shouldn't go any further in your explorations. But by the end of it, he says, okay, you've kind of proved yourself on this mission. I will allow you to continue exploring and doing what you want until maybe I see fit to do something else. But his tone about it does change over the course of the episode, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, because they passed his test and they are not savages. That's what I got.
Well, and of course, if they didn't pass the test and they were all executed, that would have been the end of the show. So.
Right.
And the human race as is.
Oh boy! Next week we need to field another crew for this show. They're all dead.
That would suck.
It sure would.
And then we wouldn't have Earl Grey.
That's right.
I know. It would be the Encounter at Farpoint podcast for that Star Trek show that only had one episode.
Oh my gosh! Could you imagine how bored that would be?
Talk about Encounter at Farpoint every week. Yeah.
Yeah. We're like, so he said this word. Why?
Look at this change in the shade of color in this scene.
So don't you find it interesting that, so Q is like listing off all of these things and Picard's like, well, I'll agree to being charged for specific charges, specific examples. And then he just was like, test us. Yeah, and so Picard's willing to put himself and his crew to represent all of humanity. That's pretty bold. And if this is the first episode where he doesn't really even know his crew that well, I mean, I just think that's pretty bold. What do you think?
It is really bold, and I think it shows you that he is a leader who's going to think on his feet and be creative about things. I mean, in a certain way, he has no choice, right? There's this all-powerful being saying, I think that you're guilty of these crimes. And Picard kind of analyzes the situation, sees the danger, and comes up with something really quickly that Q can accept to allow them to continue. It's very bold, and I think it shows his leadership and all that he's learned in his long career to be able to make that decision. I don't think somebody who had just become, captain yesterday would have necessarily done that. What do you think, Richard?
I was just about to say, I could show him how much experience he has and how much trust he has in his crew as an experienced captain. But at the same time, it's also foolish, very foolish, because you don't know who they are really. I mean, you could have a couple of bad apples, and they might ruin it for you.
Yeah. But he believes in the quality of people that are in Starfleet, and that because he's on the flagship, he's got the best that he can get because he's able to pick the crew that he has. So, but it is a risk, but it's like he has to take that risk. He has no choice, really. There's no other way out of it that I could think of.
Yeah, in this episode, definitely he has no choice whatsoever. I mean, you have an omnipotent being that could probably wipe you off the face of the earth without even thinking twice about it.
Yeah, I think
So-
it is very bold because I think it shows great Star Trek philosophy right from episode 1 that Picard is trusting in humanity and trusting in his crew that they are going to be the best and have the best character and integrity and be able to pass this test. And I think, gosh, would I be willing to do that? And I think, well, in a little microcosm, again, just going back to the classroom, and every year it's like, okay, I have these great group of kids. Can I trust that they're going to not cheat, to, do their best and have integrity during this school year? And every year I'm just so hopeful. And then I catch those little cheaters and I'm like, oh, I'm ruined,
But unlike Picard, you don't get to handpick your students.
Yeah, that's true.
That is true. That is true. That's funny. That's funny.
I mean, because that is really what he does. It's like, okay, there's this new ship that's launching. I'm the captain. Here's who I want as, first officer and tactical and operational, all this stuff. He gets, at least for the senior staff, I think he gets to choose that. So that helps.
Right. Fun.
Now Amy's fantasizing about the possibility of choosing the students she can have.
Yes. Oh, it's my Christmas wish.
But some of them are listening.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. There you go. I actually saw a couple of things on the how creative kids are at cheating and everything, like putting number. Or
wait, like I said, her students are listening. Don't give them cheating tips.
Right. Oh, sorry.
We don't
sorry.
need to give them any
My
more
bad.
ideas.
Well, if they want to know tips and tricks, we can always go to the patron zone and they have to pay for it.
Oh, no.
So yeah, there you go.
So one thing I totally picked up. So after listening to the Standard Orbit and then hearing the Law and Order gong gong, the dong dong,
Yeah.
that totally came from this episode with the little actor ringing the bell, dong dong.
Oh, right.
That totally came from Encounter at Farpoint. The dong dong was stolen. It's there.
Oh, did
in
Law and Order
Encounter at
start
Farpoint.
after that?
What?
Did Law and Order?
When
So
did
Law and Order
yeah.
started after
Sure.
TNG? I gotta look it up. Because I'm not. You're right. It did.
This came out in
Yeah.
87.
No, you're right. The first Law and Order is 1990.
but the gong gong thing, I'm sure, has been around for a long time.
Well, it's definitely prevalent in this episode.
See,
And
it
just
is.
throughout the whole thing, I was like, oh my
Or
gosh,
you-
that
you-
is so
you
Law
very
and
well-
Order.
That's
It
interesting.
very well could have been. It very well could have been the inspiration to.
Yeah, I didn't think
Yeah,
about it
very well
because,
could.
like, in some ways, like the tone and like the actual sound is a little different. But wow, I
No,
could
it
see
sounds
that.
the same.
It doesn't sound exactly the same.
Well,
but,
not exactly, but it's the deep dong dong.
Huh.
That's the name of the title right there.
I was just thinking the same thing.
People
We'll
are
just
going
call
to
it
think the
dong dong.
content of this episode is very different. Call it gong gong.
Gone gone or dong dong.
Dong
I'm
dong.
saying gong gong. Oh, okay.
Okay, moving along.
Wait. Before we move along to the next one, so
Okay.
what do we think of the outcome of this trial that Q is going to allow them to continue? Because I think that's unusual to kind of leave it open ended. He doesn't really give a verdict. He kind of says, "I'll be watching you."
Yeah, but he says that you've passed the test. Just this one.
Yeah, but like in All Good Things, years later, he says the trial never ended. So it's kind of like it just
But we
goes
don't know
across the
that
whole
yet.
series. Yeah, we don't.
Yeah, but I mean, obviously we know that the finale is obviously what it is, but he did say test us. He didn't say, test us after this mission or whatnot. You know what I mean? Like that would suck.
Just hang over our shoulder for 7 years. It'll be cool.
yeah. While I'm just captaining the Enterprise, not for the rest of our life, just the Enterprise.
No, I just think it's interesting because it's a little more ambiguous than you usually see. But
Yeah.
Well, I have to say that this is a great episode, and I feel a great joy and gratitude for this episode. Because that's
see
where
my
I
eyes
get
roll?
my
It
tagline.
is.
I'm so happy.
I always think of you when I see that scene at the end. I think of Amy and Space Jellyfish.
Yes.
Jellyfish. All right. So moving along to terrible episode.
Oh, it is
Justice.
It's not terrible. It has some fashion problems, but
No, the fashion choices are great. I'm just saying, you know, the ending was terrible. No.
okay. Well,
like-
let's take it from the.
Okay.
Well, okay. Well, so what's interesting about this one is there is a trial, but it's a fairly small part of the episode. Like the actual like hearing that they do is just kind of toward the end, so there's much less of an emphasis. But there's some interesting stuff that's going on in here. Amy, what do you think of Justice?
I think it brings up some really good points because they are coming at this from the perspective that, you know, the law and justice creates their society of peace and tranquility, you know, and so they have studied, you know, and they reference, look at us before we had law. We were hurtful and savage people. And now we have this peace and tranquility because of the law. And so they're really holding it to a high standard that, you know, a society that's going to be successful needs to have law and justice. And I think that's an interesting idea.
I have a question about their system of laws, though. So basically, what we see here is that they have this punishment zone that's marked off. And if you commit some crime, knock over the plants or whatever, then you'll be put to death. But there's just this punishment zone. Like, what is the punishment for committing some other crime outside of this zone anywhere else, like in that city or planet? It doesn't make
sure
sense
it's
to
the
me
same
that
thing.
would work. No, but they say there's one zone.
Well, I mean, like, you know, outside of whatever the perimeter is, I'm sure there's a perimeter. We just never saw it or something like that.
No, but even if there's more than one zone, they're marking them off and saying, don't do this here. But what about everywhere else?
Well, I understood it that punishment is death for any law broken.
Within that zone.
No, for any of their laws. So yeah, you have a zone thing and you have a law that says don't steal and you have a law that says don't kill. Like any law that's on the books, they're going to punish by death. That's the only punishment that they give.
I had a different understanding that they're just specifically marking out this one zone, and that's where the death penalty applies. And everywhere else, it's a little murky what their actual laws are.
No, I think it says that punishment is death for any law broken. Well, that's what I put in my notes.
Okay.
But
anyway, it is a
reserve the right.
harsh justice system for sure.
It
very
is
absolute,
you know,
yeah,
and
very
that's
absolute.
what I think is so interesting about it. It's like, can you have one punishment for every single law? You know, and they ask the question, when has justice been as simple as a rule book?
And when has the law ever been absolute without any exceptions, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And they talk about that. Like where is the exercise in exceptions? Yeah. And I think you get that a lot when you're dealing with people, you know, I mean,
Yeah.
it's so variable and there's extenuating circumstances in a case by case. And I believe that you just can't have this one law and expect it to work in every situation.
Right. I mean, and the Prime Directive's the same way, right? It can't be rigid for everything. Although, you know, they talk about the Prime Directive at the end, but doesn't it seem like they're breaking it already because they visit this planet that seems like it's a pre-warp civilization and and they're just beam down and see what's going on?
Well, but they did have, well, I guess not on the initial, but they did have permission to bring others down.
But they're not
I
even
don't know
supposed
on
to
the first
contact
time.
pre-warp civilizations. Although I don't know if that's established this early in TNG, but
Yeah.
anyway, that seemed odd. But so Wesley breaks this law and they I mean, what's interesting about their system of justice is it seems like there isn't really a trial at all that's supposed to happen. There are these people that come by, these lawgivers, and they say, okay, is there a witness? Does he admit to it? Okay, let's put him to death right now. So there's like not even a trial at all. So that's like probably even more extreme than guilty until proven innocent. It's just like, you know, guilty and now let's put you to death. It's very extreme.
Yeah. Anyone to say
yeah.
witness, bam, you're dead.
Witness, oh, and you admit to it? All right, let me just take this and kill you on the spot. Like, wow, that's pretty crazy.
And it's not even like a phaser or something like that. It's like it's syringe
It's like
with
some-
some kind of drug in it, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
it will be painless. Oh, really? The needle's going to be painless too? Like, ow!
Not compared to the poison that's going to kill you.
Yeah. So, but I mean, they have that, and then it almost seems like they say, okay, well, we'll have to have this hearing and hold him. But it almost seems like toward the end, it's just like a discussion they're having, like, he broke the law. Oh, the law shouldn't be absolute. It doesn't seem as much like a trial as sometimes you see elsewhere in TNG, where it's like, here's the defense, here's the prosecution. They have argument, like in Measure of a Man that we'll talk about. It's much more like formalized, and this is just kind of a discussion almost, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I sort of feel like they sort of cheat a little, because then they say, well, these laws were given to us by, who was the being that
God. They call it God.
Yeah, they call it God, the thing that's circling. And so I sort of wish that they would have taken ownership for their own laws. And they're like, well, if we break this law, then we're going to be punished, type of thing. And I just...
Well, they're afraid of retribution. I wish they would have
taken ownership of their own, because they were saying, look, we were so, hurtful and savage before we had this law that was just given to us. I don't know about that.
Well, they're afraid of retribution if they don't follow that exactly, right? There must have been some retribution before.
If they don't? Do you think if they get smite or something like that, if they don't follow the laws?
They seemed really afraid. There must have been something that happened where these laws were handed down by these beings and someone didn't follow them and got killed. And they were like, oh, we shouldn't do that again.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah.
It's death.
Yeah. Well, one thing I would have wished for this episode, though, would have been not just to see like this vessel, but to actually see the beings inside it, because I think there are some beings in there, and it would have been really interesting to have a discussion with them about how this came about. But it's very indirect, and there's just like this booming godlike voice, and then at the end they just kind of give consent for them to beam up, and that's the end of the discussion. I feel like it would have been really interesting to have like more of a discussion on that, or to have, I don't know if they could have that being at the trial. That would be weird, but
I don't know. Yeah. I actually like the idea that we don't see them. I mean, it just gives off a sense of power over not only the people down on the planet, but also with the Enterprise. I mean,
that's true.
He's willing, or whoever.
They said it's multiple beings. It's not just one that's aboard the vessel. They find.
Right. So, obviously it's just, they have obviously immense amount of power, and they're far more advanced than the Enterprise. And I just think that had for the mystery of them, of us not knowing who they are, it has a lot more weight than if we were to find out and whatnot. So
yeah, I could see that. I just always wonder what they look like.
So I had a question for you that I thought of during this episode. So we know the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, or the one. So it was asked to Picard, would you choose one life over 1,000? Mm-hmm. And Picard answers, I refuse to let arithmetic decide questions like that. Of course, I had to bring it up because it's math. But I thought, oh my gosh.
Math is a character in this episode too?
Yes, it is. I thought, wow, that sort of goes against this idea of the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. And Picard's like, nope, I'm not even going to worry about it. We're going to save Wesley, despite what it may do to the thousands of the people on the planet.
I think I think it is really interesting. Now, this is also before he mind melds with Sarek. I wonder if after that he feels differently.
Right.
But no, I find it very interesting, because it is one of those places in Star Trek where it's like, no, we're not going to do it based on numbers. I'm here to protect my crew first and foremost. Yes, the Prime Directive is important, but I can't let a member of my crew be killed. And he says the Prime Directive wasn't meant for that. It was meant to help other civilizations, but not at the expense of other people. But you see in other parts of Star Trek that people sometimes do sacrifice themselves for a civilization. But one of the things that hangs over it is, at the end, the outcome is Picard just says the law can't be absolute. And it's almost like, God, do we have your permission to beam up, and that it's okay for this? And they beam up. But it's probably going to change that civilization forever. It's probably going to have a huge impact, because this has been bringing order to their lives for so long, and it could bring a lot of disorder and chaos. Now, maybe they can hope that their god that's in orbit will do something to hand down other laws that'll help. But it's an open question. And like, I think one of the things that is really interesting is the outcome of this trial is really important, but we never get to see the full impact of it.
And then one thing that I know has happened to me, and I hear that it came up in this, and they were saying, well, is it unfair that Wesley's charged because he didn't know about this zone and stuff? And they state, well, ignorance of the law is no defense. And I just want to share a little personal story. I was driving along just a little tiny bit fast and was pulled over. It was on one of those streets that's marked way too low for the design of the street. Anyways, that's my defense. So I get pulled over and I had one of those, tree air fresheners in my car hanging off the rear view mirror.
Oh my gosh, he did not.
Yes. And he's like, that this is illegal because it's obstructing your view. And there's a $200 fine for this. And I'm like, are you kidding me? How many people drive around with something hanging from their rear view mirror? And he said those lines, well, ignorance is not a justification, is not a defense. And I'm like, oh my gosh. And he's like, well, I'll let you off with a warning. So thankfully, but I was like, I cannot believe that he was going to say, well, ignorance of the law is no defense to me.
Yeah. I have mixed feelings about that, because in a certain way it makes sense. But in another way, like in our society, there are hundreds and thousands of laws at all different levels of government. How can any one citizen really know all the content of those laws? I mean, in practice, you're probably going to be ignorant of some parts of the law, right?
Right.
Now, in the case of justice, I think one of the really weird things that happens is that Tasha says, yep, they told us about their laws, but somehow they leave out this law where the penalty is death. That seems really weird that they would say ignorance of the law is no defense, and they didn't even give them a copy of all of the laws, right? But I mean, it's similar to your situation. When have you gotten a copy of all of the current laws?
Yeah,
you'd have to look it up.
And plus, like when you move state to state, each state has ones. And, if you listen to any morning show for any amount of time, they're always going to say, well, listen to these crazy laws in these states, and they're these most random, you can't walk more than 250 steps within this, or whatever.
Yeah.
You can't sleep with a sheep or something. That's, I think, a law in Wyoming.
Well, hopefully no one is ignorant of that shouldn't happen. But oh boy, we're going to hear from listeners in Wyoming. Are you sure that's real?
No. Sleep with a sheep. Wow, Amy. Wow.
That's very different than an air freshener hanging from your rearview mirror.
Exactly. And so you're supposed to be required to know all the laws. And especially if you move around a lot, it seems a little unimaginable.
Yeah. I think it's a tough thing, but yeah, and justice is really interesting. And again, it's a really unusual kind of trial because it's this discussion and there's this godlike being hanging over it. So it's not like a typical trial. And that's one of the things I like about some of these is they're really like unusual and different kinds of courtroom dramas or trials, hearings, discussions, that kind of thing.
Okay, well, moving along, we're going to move on to The Measure of a Man. And if you guys heard last week's episode, we interviewed Melinda Snodgrass on about this episode, and everything else that she's that's going on with her as well. So,
and she wrote the episode.
And she wrote the episode.
Yeah.
So, yeah, a very good episode too.
And this is probably the most famous, courtroom drama in TNG, wouldn't you say?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I would
agree with that. Yep, definitely. Where we get to see the legality of him being sentient being. Yeah.
I think this is probably within the top 10, dare I say top 5 of all favorite Star Trek episodes of most listeners.
It's definitely in my top 10, probably top 5 for TNG. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's an incredible episode. It really is. And, of course, rewatching it recently, every time I see it, I get a little something different out of it. And it's so well written and it's so impactful. But what do you think, Richard? Is it in one of your top episodes?
Yeah, sure.
There was a hesitation there. Do you have some issues with it?
No, it's just there are other episodes that I really really like more than this one. I mean, granted, it is a very important episode. It's very touching and very heartwarming. I mean, especially when whether we I mean, to actually question whether or not he's sentient or not, kind of sucks. And then he has to actually prove, or at least his defense has to actually prove that he's a sentient. I would say it's probably right around 13, 15. It's not my 10, but
Interesting.
It's
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, definitely it's one of those important ones that need to be recognized. That's for sure.
Yeah, and there's some. Oh, go ahead, Amy.
Well, one thing that I like about this that we haven't seen with the other two is that this courtroom drama is probably the most similar to what we see happening nowadays. Like, they are calling witnesses, they're identifying people in their service and their character witness and using evidence, objections, and they have closing arguments. So this very fits into what we know as a courtroom. So I found that interesting where when we look at others, like, it's definitely out there and very creative, the way that different societies, like we just talked about with Justice or with Encounter at Farpoint. But this one, where we're in Starfleet, is very similar to what we see now. So I wonder, does our adversarial system change much between now and the 24th century?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think what's also different about this one is there isn't a crime at issue. There's a hearing about someone's status in Starfleet or in their society. So that makes it a little bit different. And also for the previous two, in Justice, it has to do with the Edo people's system of justice. In Encounter at Farpoint, it has to do with Q's notion of what justice and trials are like. So this is the first time in TNG, I think, we get to see what is Starfleet's idea of a trial or a hearing. So I think it's more traditional in that way. And and I think that it benefits from that. And I think there's something really powerful about it, because basically most of the episode is about the trial, which is different than the previous two. And you do get to see all of the arguments and the issues at hand, and, Riker doing his research for his prosecution and all of that. So, like, as far as the structure, it's very interesting. And I mean, I don't know. It's hard to like say all the things that I want to say about it, because I find just the idea that there's this hearing about someone's status as a being within the Federation, I just find to be like a really powerful thing. It feels, I mean, it's consequential the most for Data, but in some ways it feels like the most consequential thing we can look at, because a sentient being's rights should be, one of the highest things that we think of in our society, and that Starfleet thinks of in their society. So there's a lot of like really great kind of weighty issues. And actually, like, when it gets toward the end and it's ruled that, he has the right to do what he wants and he's not the property of Starfleet, it makes me tear up. It's like, this is his moment to really get his freedom in a way that hasn't been defined before.
Well, and I can see where they're coming from on the from the Federation side. That, I mean, in a sense, he kind of is a tool.
Are you saying Data's a toaster?
Not a tool. But
you're making a judge. Are you making a summary decision that Data is a toaster?
Like a Battlestar Galactica toaster? But yeah, I mean, I see where they're coming from, and I don't know. Yeah, it's just, yeah.
Well,
I mean, it's. Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh no, I was going to say. I mean, from Starfleet's perspective, they say, okay, is the Enterprise computer sentient? Can it refuse to serve you? But I mean, it's clear that that's different, because the Enterprise computer, you give it something to do, it gives you a response. For Data, he's more of like a sentient being with a rounded life, where someone doesn't have to ask him a question for him to do something, right? Or send a request to him for him to do something, because he's planning, he's, doing his duties, he's doing all of these things in his own life and trying to enrich his own life. So I think it's pretty clear that he's different.
So I was wondering, after watching these, in succession, I found it interesting because we just talked about it Counter at Farpoint and how he was saying, you can't judge me for humanity, but then he says, Picard says, we will be judged by our treatment of a race. And I thought, well, how interesting. I wonder if he has learned that we will be judged for how we treat others. I just found that interesting.
Yeah, it's a good question. I hadn't really thought about that. Although I think in an Encounter at Farpoint, they're being made to stand for, what Q thinks are the crimes of people that came before. And in this, Picard is thinking of how future generations will think of them or how it'll affect future androids. But yeah, I think there's some similarities there.
In the future, then humanity could be judged if they ruled against Data and said that he is property. Then future generations of humanity could be judged for their treatment.
They would judge it, but it wouldn't be like a trial, I don't think.
Well, but yeah, judged.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah. Okay.
I thought we would have had more to say about the Measure of a Man.
I
know,
know,
right?
more things.
Go ahead.
Oh, do you?
Yeah. So again, like you were saying, that this is different because this courtroom is different because it's not a specific act. It's more of this idea of, is Data sentient or not? And I like what Picard says. A courtroom is a crucible. In it, we burn away irrelevances until we are left with a pure product, the truth for all time. And I just sort of like that there's this underlying truth that so many things get built up around, and, sometimes the truth gets buried. And so if we really get down to the truth that Data is sentient, then that's going to stand for all time. And I sort of like that idea.
I like that too, although the idea that every single time in every single judgment that you're getting the truth is an ideal, but I don't think practically it's possible to do that.
Yeah.
Because there's lack of information for some things, or you don't know about certain other things. But like he's stating, this is the ideal, that in this proceeding, we're all doing this in good faith. We're trying to get all the information we can so we can come up with the truth. But if any of that isn't true, then you're not necessarily going to come up with what's true.
Yeah.
But I like what he says. I like the idealism of it.
Yeah. And I like when they say that a judge must be part saint and philosopher. And I think that sort of goes to the idea of letter of the law versus
The spirit of the law.
spirit. Yeah. Is that
I think
the
so.
saying?
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Yep.
so I think, what you've got to take the spirit of the law into context for each case, because you are dealing with human beings and human nature. And so, again, sort of understanding that you don't have one law that holds true for everything, that it's a case by case scenario.
Yeah. One of the things I was noticing as I was watching these episodes is that for a lot of these trials or hearings, there are important consequences that happen, or people that change because of it. So like in an Encounter at Farpoint, Q at the beginning is kind of this hostile adversary that's trying to really, punish or restrict the Enterprise crew. But at the end of it, he's going to give them a chance, even if it's reluctantly, right? And in Justice, because of what happens with Picard's actions, the Edo are likely going to be changed forever because of that. And also what's interesting in The Measure of a Man is that Maddox is very adversarial, just wants to kind of take Data apart, calls him it. And then by the end of it, he has a lot of admiration and calls him he, and has all of this respect for him. So he's changed by that process too. And I like that a lot, that these proceedings aren't just in isolation, that, you just do it and there's no consequences. There are real consequences and things that change because of these, at least the ones we've seen so far.
Well, and I found it interesting. I'm just going to throw it out there. So we have Philippa Louvois,
Yes.
and is Captain Philippa Giorgio? Philippa? Maybe.
Yeah, I did see an interview with Melinda Snodgrass where she was, or some blog post or something where she was speculating that they might have been inspired by that, or
Paying
taken that
homage
name
to.
or pay homage to it. Yeah.
Well,
That's
we
possible.
will think so. In my headcanon, it is. It's a nod to TNG.
Yeah, I think it's quite possible. They've done other nods to TNG on Discovery.
Oh,
so,
for sure. Yeah.
yeah. That is interesting. By the way, there's more about Philippa Lavoie in the autobiography of Jean-Luc Picard, which if you guys haven't picked it up, it's really good.
So the next one is A Manner of Perspective.
I have a lot to say about this one, actually.
Okay, so I'm gonna go
Are you
just
not
turn
a
off my
fan of
mic
this
and-
one?
No, I didn't say that.
Okay. You're just
I
like,
didn't say
yeah, this episode.
No. It's a really good episode. It really is. It really is.
Yeah, but well, I mean, one of the things about this also is, again, it's a really unusual form of trial that they have in the holodeck, right? They have all these recreations of the different people's testimony. And well, I mean, I guess it's an extradition hearing more than a trial. But I find it so interesting that they have sometimes these scenes from these different perspectives, from Riker's perspective, or from the scientist's perspective, or his wife's perspective, or the assistant. And sometimes they're saying the same things, but they're doing different things. Like, Riker will say something in his own kind of perspective, and it'll seem innocent. And then he'll say the exact same thing in the perspective of the wife, and he'll be like looking her up and down and like flirting with her without saying it. I find that and that points up like the difficulty you can have in a trial sometimes, which is people will remember things, even if they remember the words similarly, they'll remember the intention of it or people's body language very differently, right? Mm-hmm. So it points it up so much because you're seeing it visually.
And it's a very good tool. That would actually be very handy in even today's courtrooms. I mean, that would be fantastic if you could recreate the whole entire thing.
Maybe, but Data even says, like at the beginning of the recreation, it has, an 8 point something percent, error rate. I mean, like there's some part of it that you can't quite get. And also, like, how are they getting this information and getting like all the intonations of the voice and the body language? I mean, it seems like it would be really difficult to actually do that, and the choices that you make could like sway someone one way or another. I think it's actually kind of problematic the way that they do it.
Well, and I was quite a while ago talking with a police officer, and they were saying that eyewitness, it's not reliable. And I think this is sort of truth to that, because you're seeing different quote unquote eyewitnesses to what happened, and they just remember it so differently.
Yeah, and it's filtered through their interpretation, and then also Data programming it, his interpretation of what they mean by that. So, and at one point, of course, I think there's the assistant who is saying that the scientist talked to her, and Picard's like, hold on a minute, this is secondhand. You didn't even see this stuff, right?
Yeah, it's hearsay.
And they're going to recreate it, but they're like, okay, we'll watch this thing, So I think it's like a really creative way to do it, but it has all kinds of problems. And then what really proves kind of Riker's innocence, or that he shouldn't be extradited, is this wave that's coming from the planet, and the recreation's so good that it's just going to like blow up the holodeck. Like, how does that guy know that they're not like corrupting it and just doing that just to free Riker? Like, does that really prove anything? I don't know. It's just, it feels, I like the episode a lot, but I think it points up a lot of issues and problems with testimony that you can get and with the methods that you use to try to prove someone's innocence.
Well, and I think like you were saying, like how people perceive, that is their truth and how they remember it. And it's so interesting. I don't know if you guys picked it up, but Dr. Abgar's wife, Manua, each time her dress is a little different.
Yeah.
And when she's, when she's doing it, like one dress is very revealing. It's like open, on the chest area and stuff like this. And then when it's her time, like she's all prim and proper. And of course she would never do it. And when it's her turn to tell her side of the story, it's like Riker's piercing eyes, and he's like looking her up and down. It's like, he's this big creep. And
right.
Jonathan Frakes plays it perfectly. I mean, he is creepy. I'm like, ew.
Yeah. And what's also interesting is that in Manua's recollection, she's like, cozy with Dr. Apgar, and it feels like they love each other. And then in Riker's, there's this distance, and even though they're saying the same things, there's this distance, and like they don't like each other that much. Riker asks Troy, like, these can't both be true. And she's like, well, it's true from your perspectives or from your recollection. So,
yeah, she says, it is the truth as each of you remember it.
Which is really interesting because as Manua remembers it, Riker was being creepy and looking her up and down. And as Riker remembers it, he was being like the model Starfleet officer. And it's just I think like sometimes you inject what you think you see, right? She might have felt in some way that his presence wasn't wanted there and kind of put these things into it, or maybe he was a little bit like that. We know how Riker is. He's kind of a ladies' man, I mean, so you don't. I like how they kind of play with that. Like, what's really ultimately true here? I mean, we know based on Riker's character that he wouldn't just, go and murder a scientist and blow up a station, right? But for some of these other things, it's like, what was his behavior really like? I don't know if we really know,
Yeah, and I like the last go around when Picard sort of puts it together. And, he's like, well, I'm going to allow for all the perspectives. And maybe if we, take bits and pieces from everyone's point of view, that we will get to the real truth and what really happened. So he sort of combines all of them, which I think is very telling for how great a Captain Picard is.
Yeah. What I like about this one, too, is that there's this investigation that's going on to gather evidence. They're like looking at this radiation that's happening. So I like it's not just the hearing, but they're doing it like an investigation on the ship to support it as well. It kind of like rounds out the whole thing and makes that kind of B plot just totally support what's going on in the A plot. So I think it's a really well done.
So the next one we have on our list is Sins of the Father. This is obviously a Worf episode, and this is the
this is the one where Worf's father Duras has been judged to be a traitor to the Romulans at Khitomer, and Worf comes to challenge it. And in the end, for his troubles, he gets discommendation.
Yeah.
So, yeah, we get to see kind of the Klingon justice system, I guess. Although it's not really a trial; it's kind of like a hearing, isn't it? Just about
like a hearing,
whether the judgment should change.
Yeah.
Well, but a sentence is given. Well, I guess a sentence is I guess it's not a sentence.
I mean, it is a punishment.
Yeah, there's a punishment that's come, but it's behind closed doors.
Well, that's true.
Yeah,
they
but
don't
I mean,
broadcast
they're not really not trying to seek justice or anything like that. I mean, obviously he's there to clear his father's name, but at the same time, there's no one really being really, it's not really affecting him except for his status at home. I mean,
well, it's affected his pride and his honor.
Well, his pride, but I mean, on the
there's-
Enterprise, it has no bearing on the Enterprise.
Well, I think
Or
that
anywhere
they're
in the Federation.
in the Klingon, like, this is a trial, in my opinion. They've got a specific crime, sending and helping the Romulans.
Well, the trial
sending the
already
code.
happened, and they came up with a judgment, though, right?
No.
That Duras-
what do you
that-
mean
that
the
Worf's-
trial happened?
But his father's not.
Yeah,
but
his father
but
had
it was
already
not his
been
father.
judged as
Yeah.
a traitor to the Empire, and basically Worf is coming in to appeal the decision.
Oh, okay.
That's probably the closest. Yeah, that's probably the closest.
All right.
It's kind of it's kind of like if someone's convicted and then there's an appeal to see if that should be overturned.
Okay,
That's how I
all
think
right.
of it.
All right.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes a lot more sense. Yeah, an
Yeah.
appeal that can be overturned. Yeah, and it's a hearing format.
You're right,
versus
because Kempik tries
actual-
to reason with Worf and say, don't take this challenge. Everything will be forgotten. You don't need to challenge this. So, yeah, you're right.
But so what do we think about how justice or these hearings work in the Klingon Empire?
Well, I think it's interesting and glad that we don't have it. Like, if you are found guilty, then, for the next 7 generations, your entire family has to bear this, guilt.
Yeah, the dishonor, yeah.
Yeah.
It can be very, very harsh, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know how that's really a practical system, because if the dishonor would be that important, I don't know how it would deter people from doing certain things. Because
Well, at least
I don't know.
it's limited to 3 generations.
Is it 3 that they
Because
say?
it's not the entire line.
Okay.
It's only I think he was saying that Alexander would bear the dishonor, whereas the next generation after that wouldn't.
The
Well,
next
it says
generation.
for 7 generations in there.
Does it?
Is it?
Okay.
Yeah.
That's a long
Well,
time.
regardless, at least there's a limitation.
Well, yeah.
A few hundred years from now.
Yeah.
And I think that's got to be so tough, because I think in our current day, like if you are a felon, like it's tough to get a job, right?
Yeah.
You're on this list and you've got probation, and I'm not saying if it's right or wrong, but to have that for 7 generations.
So like you're born a
would be
felon?
brutal.
Yeah.
Would be brutal, because someone coming out of the system, it's already tough enough, and basically their life is severely limited on what they can do. And I'm not saying if it's right or wrong. Please don't go into that discussion, but that consequence to last for 7 generations would seem very unfair to your children and grandchildren for 7 generations.
Yeah, I would think that you would just, like, for someone where this happened to a Klingon and it happened for their children and the other generations, I mean, basically, there would be no place in the Empire for them. They might as well go somewhere else. And actually, there's a recent novel series, the Prey novel series by John Jackson Miller, that goes into this a little bit, where there's this group of people that have this dishonor for generations and kind of what they do with it. But you'd have to kind of either move on somewhere else, or just, wither away and die, or not have children or whatever. I mean, it just seems like such a harsh thing. Or you'd have to hope you get into favor maybe with the next chancellor. But it's a very, I think, odd way of doing things to basically say that you have to pay for, your ancestors' crimes, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that just seems like such an odd idea. I mean, because I think basically what they're saying is that this dishonor is something maybe that's inherent to your genetics or something. I don't know.
Yeah. One other thing I found interesting was, here we see the Klingons so high in integrity and honor and valor. And then we see at their high council this major corruption that's happening, and I just think that juxtaposition between that value of honoring and then there is this huge corruption, because we learn at the end of the episode that the high council knew that it wasn't Worf's father. Yeah. Right. And so they're allowing this corruption supposedly for this race that values honor and integrity so great, that I think it's a warning to us that it's like, if you say you are, then your actions really should be that. And that you can say whatever you want, but it's really what your actions are that's going to prove you. And are you, or are you going to be allowed to have corruption? Like, those who are in power, the Duras family is very powerful,
Let's see. Is this the first time that we really see that kind of corruption for the Klingon Empire? I think it might be. Yeah.
Yeah,
think so.
I think it is. Yeah.
And I mean, this is talking about, change and consequence. This is such an important episode, because this discommendation kind of hangs over Worf for a really long time. And actually the consequences of what happened in this episode kind of, I think, go all the way into Deep Space Nine. You may not know about some of those details, Amy, but I mean, they really kind of like carry that over, and there's all of these far-reaching consequences from this one kind of hearing that happens, to try to clear his father's name, and it hangs over Worf for a long time. I was trying to remember, was there a point in TNG where they end up clearing the discommendation?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I forget which episode that was. That in Redemption?
It's later. Yeah, Redemption.
With the Civil War? Okay. Yeah. But that's still like, I don't know, a year and a half or something like that. I mean, it's kind of a long time. And for someone like Worf, it's kind of a big deal. And I think it kind of changes him and how he thinks of himself. Another thing about this episode, like in Matter of Perspective, there's a nice little investigation where they're investigating like the logs and trying to find out what happens. And Picard goes to find Kahlest, and we see that he can fight against Klingons, which is cool. But
yeah,
I like in some of these ones where there's like this courtroom drama, there's this other thing that helps to support it and gather evidence, and you have that here too. This is a really excellent episode. This one's probably up there for me as well. Maybe, I don't know, top 20 TNG or something like that. It's really good.
It is
top 5 for Richard because it's Klingons. Okay,
yeah, it's like one of my favorites.
Well, I want to see your top 5 list.
Yeah, the others I sort of speed watched and, just sort of, because, I've seen them so many times. But Sins of the Father, this is the one that I watched the entire episode. It's so good. It's so good. One thing that I really like with this episode is that disaccommodation scene. And when he's standing in the circle and the High Council turn their backs on Worf.
Yeah.
Gosh, to me, that is so powerful, so filled with symbolism. It's just surprising and how much that affects Worf. That is a very, very powerful scene and it speaks volumes. I really liked that scene.
It really does. I mean, it's a very powerful ending, the way that they just leave it there with all of them turning their backs and Worf and Picard leave. And you take it in contrast to like A Matter of Perspective, where at the end of it, it's like, whew, I got cleared of murder. Let's go on to our next adventure and have some fun. And in this one, I mean, like for that one, there isn't really consequences like, oh, I was accused of murder, but let's move on. But for this one, yeah, there are huge consequences. And I like the ones where they find the right place to end it, and they find the perfect place to end it. Like the discommendation, you're just kind of left with that, like, oh my goodness, what does this really mean for Worf? And this is such a big deal for this character that I love. The ending is just really well done for that.
Poor Worf.
I know. Worf is always suffering discommendation, and Kalar gets killed, and Alexander gets
Well, if
sent
he's not
elsewhere,
suffering,
and-
he's not happy. You know what I mean?
That's right.
Or
Pain
if
sticks.
he's not working,
Yeah.
there you go. If he's not working hard or doesn't have enough work, he's not, happy at all.
Yeah. Worf suffers a lot. A lot.
He's a Klingon. He loves that stuff.
Yeah.
Well, so what? Let's talk about final thoughts. What do you guys think about this episode so far? Justin?
Oh, do you mean like
Well,
the
all of
episodes
them.
we've looked at?
All of them, yeah. All of them, yeah. That's what I meant.
Yeah, it was really interesting to look at it from this perspective, because usually, maybe we're looking for a certain character or looking in a certain season or, doing a rewatch. It was interesting to just isolate kind of all the trials and hearings and different proceedings. I mean, one of the things that I took out of it was there's some unusual things here. Out of all the ones that we looked at, I think the only one that felt more like kind of a standard recognizable kind of trial proceeding was The Measure of a Man. For the rest of them, it's like, Q's Court of the Crimes Against Humanity, or Injustice, it's the Edo people system of law. And A Matter of Perspective, it's this kind of strange holodeck thing where they're watching things happen. And in Sins of the Father, you get to see the kind of Klingon system. But I think what I found is that TNG had some really great kind of creative ways of doing these legal dramas. And I really appreciate that for the variety. It wasn't like, okay, this is the same thing they did before, but just with a different person and a different crime. So that's, and what I also took out of it was a lot of these things do really have important consequences. It's not kind of restricted to this episode, or it makes you think, like in the case of Justice, how it's going to affect the civilization afterwards. So, I mean, I think for the ones we've looked at in the first half here, I mean, they're some great episodes and very creative with a lot of consequences.
Yeah, I have to agree. When we first got the email from Rebecca Skipper and saying, you should do this, and Standard Orbit did it. And, it's like, oh, well, yeah, there's a couple of them. And then to come to find out, there were 9 episodes, with courtrooms type of ideas. It's like, oh my gosh, yeah, we definitely need to do this in 2-parters, because the ideas and philosophies that are just so relevant, not only back then, but nowadays, is so important to go over. And I'm so glad that we were able to look at, these first few episodes in the first half of the season or series, and look at, what does it mean to have, laws and justice and honor, and these big ideals of what is it? And so I'm so glad we got to do this. And yeah, to see others' interpretations of, well, what would this society, what would their courtroom drama look like, and how, would we do that? I just think it's so, so interesting. And I'm so glad that we got to do this. I think this is a really interesting way to look at Next Gen through this lens.
Yeah, and I mean, one thing you mentioned about the big questions, I mean, there are some big questions we talked about, like what's the right way to do a legal proceeding? What's really a crime? How should a hearing happen? What's the truth? Can you trust witness testimony? So there's a lot of really interesting things that I don't usually think about when I'm watching Star Trek. So I think it was really great reviewing these.
Yeah, one of my while I was watching all these episodes, one of the things that I find myself doing is like, no, that's not right, or no, this is not how it's supposed to be done, and stuff like that. And I do that typically that's why I don't watch Law and Order or any kind of criminal justice television show or courtroom drama show, because it bothers me quite a bit. I'm glad that we're doing this, and looking over these episodes, it definitely brings a different kind of lens to it about justice, and it's definitely a different way to look at it. So yeah, I'm glad we're doing this. So I'm excited for next time. So we'll
wrap
have
it
some
up.
more.
Yeah, I'm excited too. We've got some there's some good stuff here in Next Gen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, everything that you guys are saying, we're like hitting on. I mean, I didn't really speak much, but like everything that you guys were talking about, we're right on the nail. But I had more, but I don't want to turn this into a lecture.
Well, you're also the judge taking our defense and prosecution arguments, right? So
that is true. It's very true. Very true. Yeah.
Are you ready to judge us, or is that next time?
That's going to be next time.
Okay.
Like you said, provisionally. So yeah,
Ooh.
we'll figure it out next time. Well, it's been so much fun prosecuting these hosts, but that isn't the only thing we've been talking about here on the network. Here's what you might have missed elsewhere on Trek FM.
Previously on Trek.fm, Earl Grey.
Exactly. I mean, like Arsenal of Freedom, like there's plot A, plot B, and plot C, if you look at it. I mean, this episode really has a lot going, because when I think of Arsenal of Freedom, I don't think of it as a Geordi episode, but yet we've just mentioned two really important moments with Geordi and him taking command and, building his character. So it's a great episode.
Stage 9, a podcast about the people who make Star Trek.
I mean, it's, there's a scene with a bear and Leonardo DiCaprio and, whatever.
As I understand it, it's not a pleasant scene. They're not high-fiving each other.
It's pretty intense, I wouldn't say it's unbearable, but it's pretty intense. Waka waka. Anyway.
The 602 Club.
For me, first of all, it only being the second Star Wars book I've ever read, I like the difference of having a series of short stories and not just one novel by one author like the Claudia Gray book that I read, Leia, Princess of Alderaan.
The Edge, a Star Trek Discovery podcast.
Okay, so I'm reading this really great book that I recommend. It's The Ultimate Star Trek and Philosophy, The Search for Socrates. It's a collection of stories from all different authors, and it's been on my bookshelf for a year.
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
Check out all of these shows and join the conversation about your favorite corner of the Star Trek universe and beyond. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. If you're an Apple user, be sure to hit the subscribe button in Apple Podcasts on iPhone, iPad, or Apple TV, or the desktop iTunes app to get the latest episodes as soon as they are published. And please leave us a star rating and written review. You could have a chance to win that Juan Ortiz art book, and it helps other listeners find us.
If you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered as well. You can find our shows on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, and most third-party apps, and you can stream and download the MP3 file from our website or grab the RSS link.
We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's show, and there are many ways for you to do that. The best place to join in the larger conversation is the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type Babel, Babel, into the search field on Facebook, and it should come right up.
If you'd like to send us an email, and we love getting your emails, you can use the form on our website at trek.fm/contact. Choose to send to a show and select Earl Grey. That will come right to us. You can also find the network on Twitter at Trek FM and on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM.
So, Amy, where can people contact you?
Well, you can find me here on the network. I host a little show called The Edge, and that's about Star Trek Discovery. You can find me on Twitter at Miss Amy Nelson, and you can find me, best place, on the Babel Conference, because I love keeping up with you guys there. And Richard, where can people talk to you about having mercy for your hosts?
What's mercy? Well, they can find me on Facebook. I'm also on the Babel Conference. I pop in here and there. And they also can find me on Twitter. My handle is xransom. So, Justin, where can they find you if they want to talk about crazy, crazy state laws?
Well, if you want to talk about that, you'll probably have to go somewhere else. But if you want to talk about Star Trek, you can find me on Twitter. I'm at TrekFan4747, where I tweet about nothing but Star Trek, and currently tweeting out my Season 4 rewatch of The Next Generation. And you can find me hanging around the Babel Conference on Facebook.
You know, if you'd like to help us keep all of our shows coming to you each week, you can become a patron of the network at Patreon. Visit patreon.com/TrekFM. That's patreon.com/TrekFM. Sorry, listeners. You can get all the details. And what are those details? They are early access to episodes, exclusive content, producer credits, and more available through our patrons' website, Patron Zone. It requires a great deal of money to produce, host, and distribute these shows each month. We really appreciate any support you can give us and hope that you will join the team. Join the Earl Grey team. Again, you'll find the details at patreon.com/TrekFM. And we'd like to take this opportunity to recognize and thank our current associate producers, Norman C. Lau, Justin Ozer, and Michael Huter. Thank you so much for supporting Trek FM and Earl Grey.
So join us next time for another cup of Earl Grey.
I plead guilty. Provisionally.
Great joy and gratitude.
Woo! Go Army!